On the 2nd of June 1953, as millions worldwide riveted their gaze on young Elizabeth in Westminster Abbey, no one knew about a secret. Even the Queen herself had no inkling that nestled in the folds of her gown, precisely where her left hand would rest, a tiny symbol lay hidden, a clandestine emblem stitched there without her knowledge or consent. Why did the great couturier Norman Hartnell take such a bold, risky step? What compelled him to embroider a personal, almost pagan charm for good fortune into the British Empire's most significant garment? Today, we'll unearth the story of not just a dress, but a talisman destined to protect the Queen on the most pivotal day of her life. Britain, barely recovered from the scars of the Second World War and witnessing the twilight of its colonial might, desperately yearned for a symbol of rebirth. That symbol was to be the coronation of the young, 27-year-old Elizabeth. This wasn't merely an ascension to the throne, it was a beacon of hope for a new Elizabethan era, reminiscent of the golden age of her illustrious namesake. In this climate of anticipation and transformation, the coronation gown couldn't be just a beautiful dress. It had to be a manifesto. The creation of this manifesto was entrusted to a man who understood the language of royal protocol and opulence like no other, Sir Norman Hartnell. Elizabeth's beloved designer, the creator of her wedding gown, Hartnell was not merely a fashion designer, but a court artist, a maestro of embroidery and silhouette. He possessed the unique gift of transforming fabric and thread into symbols of state, all while preserving grace and femininity. His signature style was always a complex, multi-layered symbolism, cloaked in impeccable form. Upon receiving the commission in October of 1952, Hartnell delved into the archives. He was tasked not simply with sewing a dress, but with continuing a centuries-old tradition, while imbuing it with a contemporary spirit. He meticulously studied the coronation ensembles of her predecessors. Queen Victoria's gown served as the benchmark of imperial grandeur, opulent yet austere. Queen Alexandra's attire, in stark contrast, was remembered by contemporaries as an excessive profusion of jewels. Hartnell needed to strike a golden mean, avoiding both Victorian ponderousness and Edwardian ostentation. The designer presented the young queen with 9 distinct sketches. Each was a variation on themes of British history and heraldry, but Elizabeth, possessing refined taste and a remarkable assertiveness for her age, introduced crucial revisions to the process. It was she who insisted on 2 groundbreaking ideas that would define the masterpiece's eventual appearance. First, she requested that the embroidery be not traditionally monochrome, but rather colourful, imbuing the gown with vibrancy and freshness. Second, and most significantly, Elizabeth decreed that the gown should feature not only the emblems of the United Kingdom, the Tudor rose of England, the Scottish thistle, the Welsh leek, and the Irish shamrock. She also desired to see embroidered upon it the emblems of all nations of the Commonwealth, from Canada's maple leaf and New Zealand's silver fern to India's lotus flower and Pakistan's wheat sheaves. This was a bold political statement. Her coronation wasn't merely the triumph of an old empire, but the birth of a new alliance of equal nations. Thus, the gown's concept evolved from purely British to truly global. At the heart of this masterpiece lay not merely silk, but the finest white satin, sourced from the ancient Lullingstone Silk Farm in Kent, the very same establishment that had supplied silk to royalty for centuries. It was not mere fabric, but a living material, feather-light, with a pearlescent sheen capable of catching and reflecting even the faintest ray of light. And it was within this delicate fragility that the project's primary technical drama unfolded. For upon this ethereal foundation, an embroidery was to be laid, its weight comparable to that of a light chainmail. At the very first fittings, Hartnell and his team faced a catastrophe. Under the weight of thousands of pearls, crystals, and dense stitches of gold and silver threads, the delicate silk sagged, forming unsightly wrinkles and creases. The gown, symbolizing unity and power, was literally buckling under the burden of its own symbolism. The task seemed impossible. Reducing the amount of embroidery was out of the question, as it would mean offending one of the Commonwealth nations whose emblem would have to be removed. The solution, discovered by the head seamstress, was ingenious in its subtlety. The dress received a hidden internal framework. From within, the thin silk was reinforced with 3 layers of stiff tulle and a lining of thick taffeta which bore the main load. A horsehair braid was sewn into the hem, giving the skirt the necessary stiffness and bell shape. As a result, from the outside, the gown appeared ethereal and flowing, but inside it concealed a complex engineering structure that supported all that precious weight. The embroidery itself was a poem, told with needle and thread. 6 embroiderers from the Royal School of Needlework toiled for over 3,000 hours, as if painting with the finest needles on a silk canvas. The English Tudor rose bloomed with delicate pink petals. The Scottish thistle was rendered in amethyst and purple hues, and the Welsh leek, to the surprise of many, was conveyed using soft white silk and tiny diamonds, mimicking dew. But this was not merely embroidery, it was true jewel inlay. Each flower and leaf was dusted with thousands of tiny seed pearls, creating the effect of shimmering frost. Between them, diamonds and colored crystals, chosen to match the threads, sparkled. This wasn't a gaudy glitter. It was a delicate luminescence designed to come alive under the candlelight and spotlights of Westminster Abbey. The gown's silhouette was a tribute to a new era. A narrow bodice, a cinched waist, and a full, flared skirt. This was the royal version of Dior's new look, a symbol of post-war optimism and femininity. It didn't restrict movement like Victorian-era dresses, but lent the young queen's figure a majestic yet graceful bearing. Imagine for a moment that you could touch it. You would feel the coolness and smoothness of the silk, and then the tangible weight of history in your hands. You would hear the soft rustle of the dense fabric with every movement, a sound that would soon echo through the ancient abbey, announcing the birth of a new era. On the morning of the 2nd of June, 1953, London was steeped in a grey, damp drizzle, but the inclement weather only intensified the contrast with the marvel that was about to appear to the world. Millions of people, for the first time in history, glued to the screens of black and white televisions, held their breath. When the golden gold state coach, like a fairy tale vision, pulled up to Westminster Abbey, the moment of truth arrived. The doors swung open, and a young queen stepped onto the ancient stones. In that instant, the gown was revealed to the world in all its splendor. Even on the imperfect screens of the time, its radiance was apparent. This was not a static museum piece, but a living, breathing organism. Under the light streaming through the abbey's stained glass windows, the embroidery came alive. Each crystal flared, each pearl gleamed with a soft moonlit glow, and the colored silk threads created the illusion of a blooming garden spread across the queen's hem. The gown became for Elizabeth not merely an outfit, but ceremonial armor. It lent her delicate figure monumentality and stature. The weight of the silk and jewels on her shoulders was merely a rehearsal for the weight of St. Edward's crown, which she was about to receive. Every step the queen took was measured, and the gown moved with her, not restricting, but enhancing the grandeur of the moment. It became the final flourish, transforming a young woman into a monarch, the living embodiment of a nation and the Commonwealth. The contemporary reaction was astonishing. The next day, newspapers worldwide splashed Elizabeth's photos across their front pages. Journalists vied to describe every detail, every symbol. They spoke not of fashion, but of art and diplomacy. The gown was praised for its perfect balance. It was luxurious, yet not ostentatious. Traditional, yet with a clear nod to modernity. British in spirit, yet global in its message. This was a triumph not only for the Queen, but also for Norman Hartnell. He had managed to create not merely an object, but an event. On that day, beneath the arches of the ancient abbey, not only a new queen was born, but an image that would enter history textbooks. The gown ceased to be mere clothing. It became a legend, the first and most eloquent statement of the new Elizabethan era. By the unwritten laws of monarchy, a coronation gown is a relic of a single day. After the ceremony, its destiny is a glass museum display case or the quiet of a royal archive where it transforms into a silent witness to history. But Elizabeth II, from the very beginning of her reign, demonstrated a unique blend of fidelity to tradition and pragmatic innovation, reserving an entirely different fate for her attire. She did not allow it to become a museum exhibit. She made it work. The golden age of this gown was not limited to one day in Westminster Abbey. It stretched for several years and spanned the entire globe. The Queen made an unprecedented decision. She wore her coronation gown 6 more times, and each time it was a carefully orchestrated diplomatic gesture. This was not a desire to relive a triumph, it was the fulfillment of a promise embroidered into its hem. The gown, adorned with the symbols of Commonwealth nations, was meant to be seen by the peoples of those nations. Imagine the effect. It's one thing to see a black and white photograph of the coronation in a newspaper, and quite another to behold your Queen opening a parliamentary session in Canada or Australia in that very same legendary gown. It ceased to be mere attire and transformed into a travelling relic, living proof of Commonwealth unity. Born in misty London, it saw the bright sun of the West Indies and the official halls of Canberra. For millions of people, it became a tangible symbol of their connection to the crown. Thus, the gown became an integral part of the young Queen's image, her principal calling card on the world stage. In the crucial early years of her reign, when Elizabeth needed to assert her authority and build relationships with Commonwealth leaders, this garment spoke louder than any speech. It wordlessly declared, "I am a new type of monarch. My power lies not in imperial dictate, but in alliance and respect." For Elizabeth herself, redonning this attire was undoubtedly a deeply personal act. Each time she felt the familiar weight of silk and pearls on her shoulders, she seemingly relived the vows she had made at the altar. The gown was not merely a memory, but a constant reminder of her duty and mission. It was her talisman, her ceremonial armor, which she wore when embarking on the most important diplomatic campaigns of her early reign. Therefore, the golden age of this gown was not a single moment of glory, but an entire era during which it actively served its queen and her empire, transforming from a work of art into a powerful instrument of state policy. But behind the flawless facade of this triumph lay its own secrets and quiet conspiracies. The story of the coronation gown, for all its public visibility, is not without subtleties and details that were not intended for outside eyes. These were not scandals in the usual sense, no financial machinations or court intrigues. The gown's secrets were of a different, more nuanced nature. The most significant of these was woven into the very fabric of the gown, and even the Queen herself was unaware of it. Norman Hartnell, a pragmatic yet superstitious man, fervently wished for the long and arduous ceremony to proceed flawlessly. Driven by this almost paternal concern, he resorted to a small, clever trick. The designer secretly instructed the embroiderers to add a tiny, almost invisible 4-leaf clover, an ancient symbol of good fortune, onto the skirt. It was placed precisely where Elizabeth's left hand would rest during the ceremony, so that she would, unknowingly, touch her own talisman. It was a personal, almost pagan charm, stitched into the heart of a state and religious relic. The Queen herself only discovered it after the coronation. Another tantalizing riddle, one that continues to captivate the minds of fashion historians, lies quite literally at the Queen's feet. What shoes did Elizabeth II wear on that momentous day? The question, frustratingly, remains unanswered. The gown's magnificent sweeping hemline served as a perfect curtain, shielding her footwear from public view. Only in a fleeting few frames of old newsreel footage can one catch the merest hint, a momentary shimmer, the briefest peek of a shoe's toe. Were they fashioned from lustrous gold leather, perhaps? Or crafted from opulent silver brocade? Could they even have been intricately embroidered, echoing the gown's exquisite floral motifs? This small, elusive detail has forever remained the Queen's personal secret, an unrevealed whisper within her otherwise resplendent image. Yet, the most profound and hushed secret lay not in beauty, but in its very absence. At the ceremony's pivotal spiritual apex, the sacred anointing, when the monarch stands truly before God, all the magnificent splendor of the coronation regalia was deliberately veiled. Over her dazzling embroidered masterpiece, Elizabeth slipped into a simple white dress crafted from the finest linen, utterly sleeveless and devoid of any ornamentation. This humble tunic, historically known as the Colobium Cindernis, served as a powerful symbol of purity and a solemn renunciation of worldly glory. In that sacred moment, the rich, earthly gown, a vivid emblem of temporal power, gracefully yielded its prominence to a garment that whispered of profound humility before divine authority. These very details, the clandestine shamrock, the enigmatic shoes, and the humble anointing tunic, are the subtle nuances and profound whispers that elevate the narrative. They do not tarnish the legend. On the contrary, they bestow upon it an extraordinary depth, revealing that behind the magnificent state ritual resided not only meticulous human care and deeply personal secrets, but also the most profound spiritual symbolism. Following several years of rigorous diplomatic engagements, the moment finally arrived for the coronation gown to be honorably retired. Its last public triumph unfolded during the opening of the Canadian Parliament session in 1957. That memorable evening, beneath the grand vaulted ceilings of the Legislative Assembly in Ottawa, it sparkled anew, fulfilling its profound mission to forge an enduring bond between the monarch and her people, even across thousands of miles from London. Yet both the Queen and her inner circle recognized that this chapter was drawing to a close. The gown, having journeyed across half the globe, had become simply too fragile and far too precious to risk on any subsequent travels. The conclusion of its active life was not heralded by the drama of an auction nor the whispers of scandal. Instead, it was a quiet, profoundly considered decision. The very moment the gown was lifted from the Queen's shoulders for the final time carried its own poignant drama. It signified a farewell not merely to an exquisite garment, but to an entire epoch, the vibrant, often tumultuous, and profoundly hopeful initial years of her reign. Norman Hartnell's masterpiece had unequivocally fulfilled its grand purpose. It had magnificently aided a young queen in asserting her formidable presence on the world stage. Now, it was destined to assume its immutable and rightful place within the hallowed pantheon of history. Its ceremonious transfer into the royal collection signaled the commencement of its life in dignified, quiet seclusion. But this shadow was not oblivion, quite the opposite. It became a sacred haven, a place where time itself seemed to gently hold its breath. The gown was meticulously placed within a special, climate-controlled vault, an environment engineered to maintain precise temperature and humidity levels, conditions absolutely crucial for safeguarding historic silk. It no longer hangs vertically, a garment suspended in air, but rather reposes horizontally within an immense custom-built archival box, lovingly cushioned with countless layers of acid-free tissue paper, ensuring that not even the faintest crease could ever mar its breathtaking, priceless embroidery. Its meticulous upkeep is entrusted not to chambermaids, but to highly skilled conservators and restorers who approach it not as a mere garment, but as an invaluable, irreplaceable manuscript. Every single relocation it undergoes is deemed a painstakingly complex, multi-staged operation. Its epoch as a functional dress had definitively concluded. Its new epoch as a revered artifact had magnificently commenced. It ceased to be a personal item belonging to the Queen and irrevocably metamorphosed into a priceless national treasure, a powerful symbol whose perpetual safeguarding transcended personal ownership to become a matter of paramount national importance. For countless decades, it reposed in profound silence, accessible only to a select, narrow circle of its dedicated custodians and conservators. However, with the dawning of an era marked by grand royal jubilees, the golden, the diamond, and subsequently the platinum, the gown was majestically summoned forth from its honorable seclusion. Its triumphant return to the global stage unfolded within the hallowed halls of Buckingham Palace and the venerable confines of Windsor Castle, locations where truly magnificent exhibitions, meticulously curated and devoted to the illustrious reign of Elizabeth II, were masterfully staged. As if a fairy tale sleeping beauty, it stirred from its slumber, awakening to once again command the central spotlight of universal admiration. But this was a return of a different kind. It was no longer part of a living image, moving in sync with the Queen's stately progress beneath the Abbey's ancient arches. Now, it rested behind impenetrable glass, bathed in meticulously calibrated spotlights that accentuated every intricate detail, yet forbade even the slightest touch. From an active participant in history, it had transformed into its most precious exhibit. The public, queuing for hours, gazed upon it not merely as a dress, but as history itself, frozen in silk and pearls. It was here, within the hushed sanctity of the museum, that its interpretation subtly shifted. While in 1953 the world had seen in it a promise of the future, a vibrant symbol of hopes for a new era, now, half a century later, people recognized it as a testament to duty impeccably fulfilled. It had become the definitive benchmark, marking the genesis of the longest reign in British history. The symbols of the Commonwealth nations, intricately stitched upon its hem, were no longer perceived as a mere political declaration, but rather as a profound prophecy, capturing a world that had, over the intervening decades, been transformed beyond all recognition. These exhibitions afforded a privilege impossible on Coronation Day, the chance to scrutinize the masterpiece in exquisite detail. Visitors could spend hours poring over the intricate embroidery, marveling at the consummate skill of its anonymous needleworkers. Every stitch, every pearl, every crystal emerged not merely as an element of decoration, but as irrefutable evidence of the extraordinary human labor and profound artistry poured into the creation of this marvel. The gown could be read like an ancient tome, page by page revealing its embedded symbols and concealed secrets. This triumphant return to the public sphere irrevocably solidified its exalted status. Its value was no longer measured in carats or yards of silk. It had become absolute. Any financial appraisal lost all meaning, for artifacts of such magnitude are simply not for sale. Their true worth is intrinsically historical. The coronation gown ascended to become one of the nation's foremost treasures, a tangible embodiment of an entire epoch. It was its second birth, a birth into eternity. So, where does this masterpiece, which bore witness to the dawn of an entire epoch, reside today? Its permanent home is the Royal Collection, one of the most significant and pivotal art collections globally, managed by the Royal Collection Trust. It does not personally belong to the reigning monarch, but rather is held in trust by them on behalf of the entire nation. The coronation gown stands as a pivotal piece within this magnificent treasury, sharing its esteemed place alongside canvases by Rembrandt and the armor of Henry VIII. Its current status leaves no room for doubt. This is no longer an item of clothing, however regal. It is, unequivocally, a historical artifact of the highest category. It is subject to the same stringent conservation protocols as ancient manuscripts. It reposes in darkness within a specially designed, atmospherically controlled container, where every single degree of temperature and every percentage point of humidity are calibrated with scientific precision. It will never again be worn. It has been transmuted into a textile document, where each individual stitch serves as a line in the annals of history. When its value is pondered, any expert will offer a singular, definitive statement. It is beyond price. And this is not merely a poetic turn of phrase. To attempt to appraise it in monetary terms would be both futile and, frankly, irreverent. Its true worth does not reside in the pearls, crystals, or yards of silk. Their material cost is negligible in the grander scheme. Its value transcends even the genius of Norman Hartnell or the thousands of hours of meticulous handiwork. The authentic value of this gown is composed of entirely intangible assets. It embodies the value of a historical moment, forever encapsulated in fabric. It carries the immense weight of its provenance, its unimpeachable history of ownership, for it was created for one solitary individual and is inextricably linked to the name of Elizabeth II. It represents the immense symbolic capital accrued over the decades of her reign. This gown is not merely an object. It is the physical embodiment of a sacred oath pledged by a monarch to her people, and the very genesis of the longest chapter in the history of the British monarchy. So, we circle back to the question that started it all. Why did Norman Hartnell, the celebrated couturier, risk secretly stitching a hidden symbol into the empire's most significant garment without the Queen's knowledge? The answer, much like the dress itself, proves far more profound than it initially appears. This wasn't an act of audacious defiance or self-aggrandizement. Instead, it was an exquisitely human gesture, an attempt to safeguard, to bolster, to infuse a touch of personal, even irrational faith into the grandiose machinery of state ritual. In that pivotal moment, Hartnell was more than just a royal designer. He was almost a father figure, covertly pressing a protective charm into his daughter's palm before the most momentous trial of her life. This tiny four-leaf clover is the perfect metaphor for the entire gown. On the surface, it presented dazzling beauty, imperial grandeur, and impeccable adherence to protocol. But at its very core, woven into every stitch, something far greater lay concealed: human solicitude, national hope, and unyielding personal resolve. This dress was never just clothing. On Coronation Day, it served as diplomatic armor, shielding the fragile figure of a young woman from the immense burden of responsibility. In the years that followed, it was a textile manifesto, silently proclaiming the birth of a new Commonwealth. And today, gazing upon it behind museum glass, we grasp its ultimate lesson. Great jewels or legendary ensembles are not merely collections of precious stones and rare materials. They are the physical embodiments of human stories, ambitions, and passions. They are vessels into which entire epochs pour their fears and their fervent hopes. This gown absorbed post-war Britain's optimism, the unparalleled genius of its creator, and the quiet yet unshakable promise of service made by a young queen. It became the nexus where high art, grand politics, and personal destiny converged. It narrates a story not only of monarchy, but also of craftsmanship bordering on the miraculous, of symbols that can wield more power than armies, and of traditions that find renewed life in the hands of courageous innovators. It ceased to be a passive object and transformed into an active storyteller, a keeper of memory. Elizabeth II's coronation gown is far more than a masterpiece of sartorial artistry. It is one of the most luminous pages in the chronicle of the 20th century, inscribed not with ink, but with silken threads, pearls, and crystals. And as long as the memory of that queen and her era endures, this story, told through the language of silk and pearls, will remain immortal.